So just to start off here at the right note, death is not real. That's kind of the secret behind this video. The death that we human have defined, how we human look upon death, is not real. That's very important to understand. Because I know this topic is such a clenching topic for us humans to talk about, because we are afraid of death and we are afraid of being hurt by ideas that are not good for us. So I'm just gonna make it very clear right from the beginning that death is not real, and I care about you. That's why I'm making this video. So it's not just some intellectual kind of talking. It's actually more heartfelt. It's a heartfelt insight that I had literally in a spiritual experience of mine. When we die, we are actually not going extinct. We're actually becoming more conscious than we was before. And you're not losing your individuality either. You are simply becoming super conscious. It's true that you merge with other consciousness, so you feel in love with other consciousness than yourself, but your individual self is not gone in that space. In fact, if we didn't have individuals, we wouldn't have love, because love is what happens between individuals and between souls. In other words, the idea that we have as humans, that we are going to sort of nothingness after we die, is simply false, because what actually happens is that you more so become aware of everythingness. But everythingness is not as we imagine it to be. In fact, to the everythingness, what we experience here in this reality as things and space and time and shapes and forms and possibilities and so forth, is more so nothing than everything to everything. So while we are here as humans, we're actually very unconscious. So when we are afraid of losing our consciousness when we die, that's actually very opposite from what's going to happen, because we are almost dead right now. When I'm sitting here in my chair, I'm almost dead. I'm so little aware. Like, compared to my soul, I'm barely alive. When you are your soul, that's like being truly awake. And that doesn't mean that this experience as a human is not of value. It is of value, so it's not like, I'm not trying to say that we should die. In actuality, we are here by free will, on purpose, because it's important to the larger picture. Okay, so this term called ego death, there's a very valid reason for why I never choose to use that word, because I don't think it's very helpful, especially for those who are not into this already, the spirituality and stuff like that. The term ego actually is also very misunderstood, and we humans, we tend to have our defense mechanisms up when people mention that word, because we have associative memories regarding this word, which is, oh, you're so selfish, you're so egoic, and fix your ego, right? These claims that we get when we are in a fight, for example. But in actuality, that's actually projections of the ego telling that you are bad and you shouldn't be forgiven and stuff like that. That's also ego to say. A healthy ego doesn't really want to call people names and blame them for things. That's maybe usually a sign of a ego that's not very healthy, actually. But the point is that even the word ego, I tend to not use that much. And I try to avoid to use it, because I know that it's like begging for the listener to be on the guard. when I use that word. So it's a very unproductive word. And not only that, but the term ego comes from, I think, Latin or Greek or something, and it means self or I. But nobody in the world agreed upon what that actually means. So everyone have different ideas about what that is. So when people use that word, ego, usually they are not even on the same page in terms of what it means. So basically, at least what I think is that we shouldn't really use that word. I think we should come up with another term. That's my philosophy, anyway. And the term that I came up with is essentially that the ego is habitual self. The habitual self. That's what ego means to me. The habitual self. And that's why almost always when I talk about the ego, I'm saying the habitual self instead, because that avoids this whole kind of issue where you basically beg people to be on the guard and misunderstand what you're trying to say. Okay, so back to the term ego death. The thing about ego death is that on some level it's actually true that this phenomena or concept is a real thing. It's just that we shouldn't call it ego death. In this video I'm going to refer to it as ego death, just because that's what the video is about in a sense. But not in other videos, not that much at least. I hope this video can kind of clear up the junk that we have been doing out there as a human collective that want to blame each other and stuff like that. For ego, I'm saying habitual self, and for death, I'm basically saying change, to change, and that's it, to change or to wake up. It kind of depends on what kind of death we're talking about. And the irony, by the way, is that the collective of our humanity, because our collective is not only healthy, it's unhealthy collectives too. Like basically, what is unhealthy? When I say unhealthy, that primarily means to be unconsiderate or unloving towards other consciousness, essentially. And since the ego is a habitual self, both a habitual individual self and can also be a habitual collective self. If that ego has a habit that is not compassionate and not loving, that's kind of the bad side of the ego. But the ego in itself is neutral. It's not bad, not good. It's just a habit of repeating the same thing. And the irony is then that this term ego death is actually oftentimes used by more unhealthy egos to describe the phenomena, because that is like this, I hate the ego and I don't like the ego, I don't like the identity that I'm in, and so I'm going to project that out on others, for example. You actually see that intuitive hero people, since they have sensing, that means introverted sensing and extroverted sensing, lower down in their stack, they are actually more likely to have this kind of unfriendly attitude to the ego, both the individual ego and the collective ego. And that's because their own ego is full of trauma and like, since they don't like their ego, they may not easily see that the ego can also be a good thing, and something that can help them and something that can guard them, for example. Okay, so in principle, what does that actually mean? It actually means that ego death means to go outside of your habits. That means to explore the unhabituated or explore the unknown. So what's not known in our identity. That's ego death. That's essentially it. We usually use the term ego death when it's a larger event that kind of surrounds this, but it is simply to leap in to the unknown. And that means, to be fair, that one has to go past what is comfortable and what is habitual and what is known. So one has to essentially go out of the ego to do that. And it's not the ego doesn't die, but you have to disassociate with the ego and the identity that the ego have. Not to lose it completely, but kind of just to have a more objective view on reality in a way. And that's actually not thinking. Most people think that the thinking function is the objective function, but actually it's intuition. So if you go into intuition, you are suddenly able to disidentify with the ID and the image that you are and that we are. And so we can look at it from the outside. And to disassociate with this ego can of course be both good and bad. And in what way? Well, when this ego death happens in a way that is good, it becomes a revelation. So it means that you get connection with divinity and with your soul and with love and what is actually real outside of the roleplay or Maya. So that's to remember who you are as divinity, which is who you have always been prior to be born here. And that's the good part about disassociating with the reality. A good term for this is NDE, which is a term for near-death experience. And that's, check it out, that's a very you can intuitively feel, especially if you're an NF user, you can intuitively feel the truth of those stories, almost as if you already knew it. Those stories are very similar and they point to the same experience, which is to experience yourself beyond this sensory human reality. So that's essentially to experience ego death or to reconnect with who you really are. Does that mean that I'm not real? This body, is this not me? And to answer that, this is also me in a way, but it's not the true me, but it's a part of my exploration of who I am. So this human body and this personality and this experience helps my soul to understand who I am on a deeper level. So it's not that this structure is entirely irrelevant for who I am as my true self, but my true self holds a more core authenticity and also a larger experience of authenticity, because I probably had many lifetimes, for example. So when we die and wake up as souls, that can probably be compared to when we wake up from a dream in the morning and maybe we had a nightmare in that dream, or maybe it was a fairly nice dream. And when you wake up from that dream, you understand that, oh, this was just a dream. It doesn't mean that the dream was insignificant to you. Maybe it was an experience that you really liked and that you could use further in your life as a human. And that's the same as a soul. If a soul had a human experience that they find valuable, they will of course be influenced by that experience. But the good part is if it was a nightmare, that nightmare doesn't have to keep going. It was just a nightmare, and maybe it was not that much to grab from that nightmare, except maybe you had a lucid awakening in the nightmare and you could suddenly control your dream, for example. That can be a nightmare experience that turned into something the soul or human liked and had use for later. This association can also be good if it's only a coping structure in our personality, which we are finally disassociating from, so we can see that we are coping and we can see what we are doing to cope. If we are ready to face that coping phenomena. Because when we are coping, we are, after a while, we forget that we're doing it. And when we forget it, it will be so much a part of identity that we don't really we can't fix it anymore because we don't really know that we're doing it. And if this ego, this identification happens on only that coping mechanism, then it means we may be ready to deal with it and fix it and heal it. So that's also a good way to dissociate in a way, which is actually why you can see a lot of healing go on with substances such as psilocybin. I'm not saying that psilocybin and these psychedelics are the optimal way to do that, but I'm just saying that they can essentially make you ego death. So if we can dissociate from whatever mechanism that is holding this completion of that experience away, that's also a good disassociation, because it means then we can process all of that emotion out if we are ready for doing that by having a new understanding on life and so forth. And the bad kind of ego deaths would be to destroy a functional organism. Like if there's many parts that works together in a certain way in order to function, then it would be bad if one of those parts were destroyed. Everything collapses without it, if that makes sense. Ego death is also bad if it interferes with the human system or functioning in a way that is, for example, the human is wired to fear predators and bears and stuff like that. And of course you could say that trauma is a bad kind of dissociation, because it's like your consciousness or presence is leaving the body, and that means you are not longer in your body. While a better kind of dissociation or intuitive process essentially is to meditate. So when you meditate, you can leave your body without being traumatized, so basically you can go back into it. And if we leave our body through trauma, that's actually, weirdly enough, maybe when we start to develop our intuition as a personality trait. So what I'm saying is that very many intuitive people actually have more bodily trauma than they are aware of, since they don't have their body to rely on, because it's not very reliable when there's a lot of trauma and stuff coming from the body and essentially giving them the wrong signals. They actually start to learn that, they have these other faculties in their intuition or metaphysical body, which is much more reliable to them. And they are reliable, at least to understand the core functioning of reality or pre-reality, if you want to call it that. And this, in my opinion, is actually why you have NI heroes, maybe NE heroes as well, usually had some trauma in their childhood, which essentially made them forced to develop intuition rather than sensing, which is a good thing to develop, to be fair. But they had to rely on something else than sensing in order to survive. So they had to use their intuition to manifest a better future, for example. They couldn't really live in that same environment of being in a victim state, basically, where they were not able to handle reality. Actually, this is why ego death often happens when we are in very tough experiences. It's because when nothing works, when everything is no way in hell that this is gonna work out, when things get really, really, really dark, that's actually when a person is most likely to try this disidentification with their sensory self in order to see if the metaphysical self is a real self. And that essentially is very scary for us humans to try to be something else than human, if that makes sense. But in a very dark place, that's maybe the only solution or only thing left you can try. And then you are like leaping really strongly into this trust and faith and feeling that it's gotta be something more than this reality. This reality can't be it. It can't be it. And since you are in that space and you have a lot of emotion and you can direct all of this energy into that kind of focus of who am I really behind this avatar or roleplay or Maya or artificial reality, that's when people experience ego death and connect with divinity, essentially. It's not that this is the best way to do it, it's actually maybe the worst way to do it, and many people actually never make it even then, and end their life and stuff like that. So the best ways is actually through meditation and philosophy and creativity and stuff like that. It's not by going on the lowest low and hope that you wake up by like a miracle or luck or you shouldn't really bet on that because not everyone makes it really. And that's why meditation, creativity, and imagination, philosophy, stuff like that will be the more healthy way to develop your intuition and connection with the spirit. So, kind of the secret here is that all moments of ego death is intuition. So every time we use intuition, we are leaving our habitual self, we're leaving the known to understand something by exploring the unknown. And that's the secret behind intuition. And that should also, in my opinion, make this ego death concept less fearful, but more so something that you already know that you can do. And you can instead just try to increase your intuition a little by little in order to safely explore and experience this disidentification with yourself only temporarily, right? To look at what's going on and see what you can do with pure intuition or a connection with your realer self. And that also means that all moments of sensing is to be essentially unconscious in a way and allowing yourself to play the role play of being a human and being in this reality. It means to live in an identity that has dominion over your energy. So it uses your energy. Your ego takes your energy and it uses that energy based on what it habitually has been thought to do. And why is that not a bad thing? Well, because the soul wants to have unconscious processes. So the reason I can use my arms without thinking about, like, I can talk in my phone and walk and talk, and I can do many things I can drive my car even though I don't really need to pay that much attention in a way. It just happens. Like, oh, did I drive here? I was thinking about something else, right? Do you understand what I'm saying here? That's the unconscious process, which the soul really, really wants, because it means that the soul doesn't really have to focus on everything. It means that the soul can do things without focusing on everything that it's doing. So actually, to be a human is a very complex experience and complex tool to express ourselves in. It kind of makes it easy for us to have the focus we want to have. Like, I can be creative rather than focusing on digesting my food. I can be creative in that moment. And that's why unconsciousness is essentially wanted by consciousness and by experience. So basically that means that the ego is created for a good thing, not for a bad thing, even though it can be both. It's a neutral phenomena. the creation of the ego is done because it allows the soul and divinity to have a solid ground in which it can solidify their heaven, or solidify a heavenly experience. So just to repeat, the ego death is then about change, to change the ground into a more heavenly thing. At least that's what it should be about. And it's not about death at all. It's actually about being conscious. And the existence of the ego, which is both the individual ego, SI, and the collective ego, Maya, SE, is here to ensure that we develop into heaven. Because what is survival? Survival is maybe not that great in the earlier phases, but overall, the best survival strategy that there is love. So the largest collaboration of love, of an ego performing love, is the ego that will never go extinct. So when the ego is becoming fully grown, it's going to carry heaven, while the egos that didn't understand love or didn't develop into something loving will eventually go extinct, because it's like a cancer, it's destroying itself. But the healing and loving egos will always become larger. And that doesn't mean that the individual ego is bad. In fact, it's the opposite. A good collective, good loving collective, has a lot of variety of roles inside of it, and that means to have individuality. Even in my body, right here, right now, there is very different individual cells and organs for this structure to actually function at all. So individuality is very important. And about those species, though, that didn't have a good ego, for them, actually, ego death is a good thing, because when they ego death and find out that they are love and spirituality and divinity, well, they will actually look at their own species and maybe apply some changes to that species. So maybe they won't torture animals anymore or play with other consciousness in a way that is not loving. And also they would understand that it's not their fault that they're doing that. So if it's a cat, for example, that cat will understand that it's not his or her fault that she is doing this playful torturing of the mice. It's just that they didn't know better, and this happens automatically. So they basically, in that instance, would have to need forgiveness to themselves and understand that this is not their fault. It's just how things happened in the evolution line. But it doesn't mean that it needs to happen forever. So that species can then potentially, if waking up, I'm not saying that cats are going to wake up like that. That's just it's just to demonstrate my point. And it applies to humans, especially now that we are waking up and we are finding structures in ourselves that weren't very loving to ourselves or to others, for example. When we find those structures, we gotta look at them and not blame ourselves, because it's not our fault. It's just the unconsciousness. That's how it came to be. But it is our responsibility to over time change it by, of course, with respect for the ego and having patience. For example, if it's true, I'm not saying that it's true or not, I'm saying if it's true that humans do need to eat meat, for example, to have like a healthy system, then we forgive ourselves for that, but we will still aim for change by essentially making the humanity adapt to a new environment. And what is that new environment? Well, it's plants, eating plants, or fake meat if that's a good solution. And if we learn how to adapt to that, which should be a gradual process, actually all changes should usually be a gradual process, then we will evolve our ego to grow towards the the loving ego, the ego that has heaven within it automatically. So that means the first nature, which is divinity and love, becomes also true in the second nature, which is the sensing domain. Also, just a side note on this ego death thing. I know that some plant medicines like ayahuasca, something like that, is also explored like this ego death thing. But just an idea I had there. Maybe that's not complete ego death. Maybe it's more so, just at least sometimes, because I just heard some stories about this. Maybe this merging with the nature and with the Gaia or with the Mother Earth, this merging is actually a merging with another ego. So it's the ego of the planet or Maya or Earth. And this ego may be a more loving ego than what we have, for example. And that can explain this experience of how it's so much better to be more one with that larger ego than with our own, for example. Which is just an idea I wanted to include here, so I don't know. But the bottom line here is that ego, matter, and earth is the same things. And the other part, at least symbolically, we have heaven, spirit, and soul, is words that tries to capture what is outside the ego. And that means that matter is unconscious ego, while spirit or heaven is the superconscious death of the ego. So that's sort of how this works. When we are not in our matter, not in our earth, not in our solidity, not in our identity, we return to divinity, where actually our ID is the potential of everything, rather than like when I'm sitting here, I'm a manifest potential. When I'm divinity, I'm unmanifest potential, which means that the true like, or the like in divinity, or the like in intuition, is what you like of the potentials. So it's the potentials that you would like to have. That's why NFs are dreamers. It's because it's the like of what they would like to have. While sensory like or sensory feeling is instead what the human likes. It's what this reality likes. It's what they habitually is thought to like, which is often good if it's like a good part of that ego. If it's a bad thing about that ego, it's not so much a good thing. It's actually, how to say it, a like that is not aligned with love is not a good like. And to summarize what I'm saying in this video, it's don't be so afraid of dying, and don't be so afraid of death, because when we are dead, we are actually more alive. So when we are alive, we are more so dead. Like we are in a zombie-like experience. So we are walking dead here as humans. And that's not too bad. It's at least as long as our ego is programmed in a way that is not too painful, that's a good experience. As these walking dead zombies, as we are, as humans, we are alive in a role play. We are in the experience of having an identity, which is cool, but we are less able to create. We are only able to create in the extent we are superconscious or intuitive, and basically dead. To the extent we are dead, the more we are able to create. But the more we are dead or disassociated with our experience here on Earth, the less we are able to experience this reality. which is actually why you have these intuitive heroes, like Anti-Hero. They kind of feel like they are dissociated with the experience of being a human, and they like when they see humans having a fun experience as a human, because they want that too. That's why we're here, to have that experience, right? But on the other hand, when they see a human lost in their, emotions or thoughts, human emotions and human thoughts, they will of course look at that experience and be like, oh, I'm glad that's not me. I'm glad that I have this intuition and metacognition enough to see that I wouldn't listen to my feelings or thoughts in that instance, because essentially nobody wants a bad experience. We only want good experiences, and that's why we want to create a heaven on earth. However, when we have a bad experience, we can alchemize that experience into something good, like making lead into gold. We can learn something from it, and we can use the experience not to be stuck in it, but we can use it to understand what we want to do in the future. I don't want to burn my finger again on that stove, for example. And we can also overcome addiction to something negative. We can use intuition to kind of recreate it and overcome it in a way. Also, paradoxically, when we are here in this reality, we can perform a kind of love that is even higher, sort of, than the love we have in divinity. Because in divinity, love is just obvious. It just happens. And it's just how reality is, because that is reality. But in this reality, when we love unconditionally, that's actually divine even to divinity, because when we are loving here, we are doing the impossible. Okay, so this is kind of a taboo to talk about, but to end one's life is actually not the same as ego death in a way. It's actually more so, usually when that happens, it's because the person has a habitual mechanism going on, which is intrusive thoughts or something like that. So it's actually, usually it's the ego, unhealthy, toxic ego, which actually leads to this taking their own life. So that's it shouldn't be confused with ego death in this way. Of course, sometimes I'm not trying to shame people who do take their lives, because of course sometimes maybe this experience is too much to handle, high pain. You can probably think of a lot of things there, and that's understandable then, that the soul wants to liberate themselves from this experience. I'm just trying to say that usually when there is this suicidal ideation, it's usually because they have some habitual pattern that kind of propels them towards that destiny, which is, intrusive thoughts and a lot of things really that can happen there. Okay, so take care of your own individual ego, SI, and take care of our collective ego, SE. That means our nature also, for example. And treat the ego with love and patience. It's created from a heavenly purpose. And also remember that ego death, or change, which is the better word for it, really, is the way in which we create change for our species and future for our planet and individual lives. Actually, think about this. If it's true that the fish is what evolved into animals walking on Earth, then that means the fish eventually turned into maybe an ape and a human. And how did that occur? The only way that could occur is ego death. So the fish wanted to create something new. It wanted to be on land. It sounds stupid, but essentially when we really get down to it, this is what happened. It changed its ego. So rather than staying true till its old past habitual self, it started to mutate and change and have other ideas about what is real, like their identity. And they started to walk on land and maybe over many years they even became human, right? And that's a process of ego death. So it's very important to see that ego death is natural and changing a species is natural. It's very easy to think that, for example, feminism and stuff like that is not supposed to be because that's not what was in the past. But I'm trying to say that ego death or change is essentially a natural process. We are familiar with it in a way, and it's not that scary. It's just that we are wired to repeat the past, and we are not wired to not repeat the past. And that's why we need this ego death in order to step out of the past and essentially re-identify with something more, sometimes something useful to the environment. Maybe the environment change and we have to develop a new organ, for example. That's also a sort of ego death, to mutate into something new like that. So natural selection is a form of ego death, even though these are of course generational, very small ego deaths, which forms into something more significant over time. So ego and sensing is essentially the unconscious God body, or like it's God without consciousness, if you want. And the soul or spirit is essentially both sensing and intuition, and it's where we have both individuals and collectives as something conscious. And it's actually between the ego and the soul that we have the human awareness or the human experience. And above the soul we have the God, which is actually intuition. Intuition and God is the same, believe it or not, because God created us in his image. While the human or soul is a demigod, the human is more so matter than demigod, but the soul is a demigod. So pure intuition is then God consciousness. So yes, I hope that helps you understand this thing that goes around about ego death, which is often accepted mostly by the NJs, the NJ personalities, because they have introvert intuition. And usually when you have introverted intuition, your introverted sensing is fairly low, so they are not very friendly with their own identity or with their own ego. They have a very bad idea about their own ego. That idea comes from their sensing, it comes from their introverted sensing ego because it's traumatized. And I also want to remind you, use the habitual self, it's a better term, I'd say, and use also, in my opinion, change rather than death, even though I understand that death can kind of it can kind of be helpful, because when you are in the role play, you are so in the role play that you are identified with the role play, and if you think about death, it's easier to be reminded that you have to really step back, you have to really step out of the role play rather than change, because when we say change, we can confuse that with the roleplay. So maybe we can find a better word for death than change, but I wouldn't use death precisely because we have an idea about death which is not loving and not right. And you don't really have to bring up that association. I don't see any reason to. It's basically just hacking a little bit, if that makes sense. And just to explain this picture, it's essentially the intuition and sensing. It was actually a book I wrote about myself as two cats in a way. And one of the cats were my higher self, and the other cat was my lower self, which often complained, and it was about this inner own individual sensing that was not so loving to myself. And then I listened to my higher self or intuition, especially the feeling intuition of my higher self, and then I realized who I really am and how I can change, and how I can relate to this ego of mine, which I love as well, because you should love yourself in all possible ways. You have to understand what love is, and we usually don't understand what love is, but the more we understand what love is, the more everything will make sense. I hope this video was insightful, and maybe you have a better idea about what's going on with this concept we call ego death. And why, of course, I said in the video that it's a myth, the ego death is a myth, but the myth is in how we interpret this term. And therefore, don't use the term, in my opinion. I hope this video kind of made you a little bit lighter, maybe, about this topic, and you shouldn't die. You should only die to be yourself. And when you die, you can fly.